Okay, so our lecture today is going to focus on politics. We're going to go through the election of 1824 and through Jackson's administration. I want you to keep in mind that as we're going through this, we're going to end the one-party system and go into the second party system, which is going to be the Jacksonian Democrats and the National Republicans. Okay, to start us off, we are going to look at the election of 1824, which is also called the corrupt bargain. The election of 1824 not only will kind of kick off this new second party system after it's over, but it will also cause a hatred of Andrew Jackson towards Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, which we'll see and talk about further. Okay, so the election of 1824, let's see what goes down and what's corrupt about it. There are four candidates. You have John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. All four are going to be the Democratic Republican Party. Remember, there's no other party system. The Federalist Party has died out by this point. And because you have four candidates running with one party, there's going to be a lot of split votes. Like, you're not seeing one candidate hold an entire region, with the exception right here of New England, who is going to be held by John Quincy Adams. And keep in mind, John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams that we have talked about before. So, if you look at this, you notice that Jackson has the most electoral votes, 99, and the most popular vote. Okay, so when you initially look at this map, you're going to think Jackson is going to win, but that's not what ends up happening. Okay, no one gets the majority of electoral votes, so therefore it will go to the House of Representatives. Now, in the House, Henry Clay happens to be Speaker of the House at the time, and he has a lot of sway over votes. Okay, John Quincy Adams will end up offering him the position of Secretary of State, and that will indicate to Jackson and Jackson's supporters, they believe that Henry Clay ended up swaying votes for Adams in hopes to get that position, which is what created what we refer to as the corrupt bargain. Okay, so from the very end of this election, Jackson and his supporters will feel like they have been cheated out of the presidency. So just kind of keep that in mind, and that's going to cause a lot of tension between particularly Henry Clay here. And if you remember, Henry Clay, the father of the American system, the tariff, the Second National Bank, these internal improvements, that's going to lead to some problems or some areas of attack, I think, for Jackson. And we'll see other reasons for that as well. So let's move on. John Quincy Adams' administration. There's not really a lot you have to know. I do want you to put it in your notes so that you realize that he was a one-term president. And secondly, that the nullification crisis will really start under John Quincy Adams' administration. Beyond that, there's really not a lot that you're going to have to write down about what's happening here. Okay, so we're going to move on to Andrew Jackson. And there's going to be a lot under Andrew Jackson's administration. I'm going to be quite honest with you. You're definitely going to have questions on Andrew Jackson on the AP exam, on your mock exams in April, your midterm. Really going to be a big concept that you need to keep in mind and review. Okay? Now, as we're going through Jackson's administration, I want you to think about the two sides or two schools of thought about Andrew Jackson. Okay? You have the idea of whether or not Andrew Jackson is this King Andrew, this president that is expanding the powers of the executive branch, abusing his power, going against other parts of government, not being consistent with his ideas as far as states' rights or internal improvements or other things. Or is he the champion of the common man, and all of his actions kind of funnel a greater involvement of the common man in politics, within government, and protecting their economic livelihood? Okay, so those are really the two schools of thought on Andrew Jackson, and you're more than welcome to decide whichever one you think he is more of. I think you're going to see a little bit of both throughout this as we go through. Okay, so let's get started with the election of 1828. Now, at this point, we do have the development of a two-party system again. This is our second party system, our first being the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. Now we have and you see here it says Democratic Republican. This name will eventually turn into Jacksonian Democrats, or the idea of the Democratic Party, which will start here. Okay, and then you have John Quincy Adams, the National Republicans, or the Whigs, which will be there. So you're going to see these party names kind of transform. I will give you a handout to track the party system in the way that it changes over time. So just kind of keep that in mind. You will get that to be able to see. Now, as you're looking at this election, you'll notice Jackson holding most of the South and West. Okay, and then you'll see John Quincy Adams holding most of the New England states and North, except this little part of Maine. And you'll also notice the overwhelming support Jackson will receive within the Electoral College and popular vote. Okay, so he definitely wins this election. It doesn't have to go to the House of Representatives. It's a straight out win for him. Within this election, I do also want to mention the mudslinging that will occur. You're going to have a lot of kind of attacks on both sides. The most well-known attacks, as far as Jackson is concerned, is that his wife, whose name was Rachel Robarbs at the time, when they met, she was technically married to another man. Her divorce paperwork had not been secured. It hadn't been completed. And she was really kind of run through the mud with the Adams's campaign. And Henry Clay really kind of led the charge on this. His supporting newspapers ran a lot of stories about Rachel and Jackson. She's really heartbroken about the situation. I think she becomes very depressed about it, and Jackson blames Henry Clay for this. Okay. Now, as far as Jackson's attack on Adams, there was two big ones. Both of Jackson's attacks on Adams are untrue, whereas Adams' attacks on Jackson are true. Okay. Adams comes from a very Puritan moral background, and when Jackson and his supporters end up saying that Adams had given 2 girls to the ambassador of Russia, and that the second one being that Adams had used money, federal money, to purchase a chess set and a pool table for the White House for the purpose of gambling, you know, those attacks are not true, but at the same time are attacking Adams's moral character. Okay. So Jackson ends up winning the election, and he will start his campaign. This is his triumphant comeback from the corrupt bargain of the election of 1824. So towards the end of the election, once he wins, but he's not necessarily inaugurated yet, you'll have the death of his wife, Rachel Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson's going to blame Henry Clay's attacks, John Quincy Adams' attacks, on contributing to the death of Rachel Jackson, causing her to have a broken heart, being depressed, which makes her health worse, leading eventually to her death. Jackson is going to end up blaming Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams for their attacks on Rachel Jackson. Okay, so let's move on to Jackson's administration. We're going to go through several parts, several important events that you need to be aware of for Andrew Jackson's administration. So we're going to start with the increased democracy, or the growth of democracy. This idea that democracy is expanding to other groups within the United States. And to start that off, we'll have the increased suffrage of white males. So what causes this is the property requirement to vote is going to be lifted. Prior to this, in order to vote, you had to own property. If you did not own property, you would not be in the electorate of the United States voting for president or other offices. And then we're talking about increased democracy for white males. I do want to link this to some of the reform movements that are happening in the 1830s and 40s. As democracy is increased for the white males in the United States as far as non-property owners, you know, the lower economic classes, you are going to see movements and reform movements for women's rights to vote during this time period, which you remember reading about within your textbook. But a lot of this increased democracy is going to be linked to some of those reform movements. And we'll get to the public school movement here. We'll talk about it more when we get to the reform movements as well. So the party nominating committees versus caucuses is another increase of democracy. You're having more people have a say-so and nominate candidates for office, including the presidency eventually with national conventions and others. But, you know, this nominating committee movement is going to make sure that more people, not just the leaders of the party, are being able to nominate and select who is going to run for their political party here. And that's going to develop over time as well. The public school movement is going to be very important as far as increased education for all parts of the nation and all economic classes. You know, we'll talk about Horace Mann and the public school movement in Massachusetts, but predominantly in the South, this is growing as well, which is important. And then finally down here is popular campaigning. So you are going to have a difference from before where nobody would really put their name in, because if they were seen as wanting the office too much, they might want it for the wrong reasons. So here you're going to start having popular campaigning, and that'll increase through the 1900s. We'll talk when we get to the election of 1896 a little bit more about the growth of popular campaigning, but it's going to start here. Okay, so let's move on. I do have a map that I want to show you, and this is voting requirements in the early 19th century. So in the early 1800s, we have 1800 here, and you see the property qualification being important to these areas. That is going to reduce the right to vote to people who do not own property, that lower economic class. As you move into 1830, you see North Carolina and Tennessee are really the only two, well, Rhode Island here, the three states, excuse me, that still have the property qualifications. Now, this was done by state basis, but Jackson, you know, definitely advocates for this, and it changes over time, so you'll see that. Now, Jackson in the executive office. I want to talk about how it's set up first, and then we'll go through some major events of the office. So the first thing you have to understand about Andrew Jackson is he will use the spoils system. Now, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, to the victor goes the spoils, every time you hear the spoils system. Now, the idea here is that the president coming in will be able to clean out the parts of the executive office and appointments that were done by the previous president. So, you know, when Jackson comes in, he's going to clear out all of Adams's supporters within the executive office, and he is going to place into those positions, he's going to appoint and offer jobs to people that had supported him politically. So the idea of the spoils system is that you're rewarding people who gave you political support with government jobs. Again, you're rewarding people who gave you political support with government jobs. That doesn't necessarily mean they're qualified for those jobs, okay? And it doesn't necessarily mean you have the right people for those jobs. It's possible, but it's not necessarily true. And that's the system that will remain intact for a period of time. Jackson will also use a system of rotation, meaning that if one person is doing a good job in one cabinet position, he might rotate them to another cabinet position to continue their work. And that system of rotation will be used predominantly by Andrew Jackson. Okay, the second term up here you need to be aware of is the kitchen cabinet. And this is a group of informal advisors and friends that held informal meetings in the kitchen. They weren't technically cabinet members, but they're a group of people that Jackson would use for advice informally. And one of those individuals was Martin Van Buren, who was a very influential man and will actually be Jackson's successor for president later on. So just keep that term in mind, okay? Check this out. Peggy Eaton was the wife of Jackson's Secretary of War. She ran a boarding house, and it was rumored that the Secretary of War and Peggy Eaton had a premarital affair, which is very scandalous for the time period. Now, whenever she came to events where other cabinet members' wives were there, oftentimes they would be very rude to her. They would kind of shun her from the group, particularly John C. Calhoun's wife as well. Now, Jackson, you know, this hurt his heart because it was very similar to his wife Rachel's situation, and he felt like he needed to protect Peggy Eaton. Oftentimes he would talk to his cabinet members about being kind to her, his cabinet members' wives to stop snubbing her at events. Now, in the end, Jackson's cabinet he'll request their resignation. All but one will resign over this incident. You know, I will note here as well, Jackson's vice president, John C. Calhoun, will resign later on in 1832 based on some other events that we're going to talk about and conflicts with Jackson. So, you know, he kind of cleans out his cabinet there. So, we're about up with time for this video. We're going to continue with Jackson in video number 2. So be sure to focus on the events of Jackson's administration in there.